Hello, I'm just going to turn this around a little bit. So you don't see my kitchen as much. So today I wanted to talk about podcasting. It's a new year and often people have new strategic goals, and surprisingly, or maybe not, I'm finding that podcasting is one of them. I have had several people already in this last week approach me to say, look, I'm thinking of starting up a podcast at some point. I really like your advice about how to do it. So for those of you who don't know, I'm better known as the Joyful Frugalista and also well known as a podcaster because I launched the Joyful Frugalista podcast in March last year. I launched it in early March. And so I launched it in early March. In retrospect, it was incredibly good timing, but of course I had no idea there was going to be a mass pandemic closed down and a lot of people would be listening to podcasts during that time. I was also incredibly fortunate that my podcast was picked up within about 2 or 3 weeks of release by the Canberra Times, who did a roundup of podcasts to listen to during COVID. So it was incredibly lucky that I had those things, but I guess, things sometimes aren't necessarily good luck. Just 1 minute. But anyway, back to podcasting. People often ask me, well, should I start a podcast? Well, should is a loaded question and it implies guilt and it implies a lot of things. I would say, could you start a podcast, and do you want to start a podcast? And in doing that, there's a few things, I guess, to consider. And the first is just how popular podcasts are. Now, I know there's a tendency to think that podcasts have been overdone already. There are so many podcasts that are out there. During COVID, ABC did a spoof where they had a number of fairly famous people saying, whatever you don't do, don't the F start a podcast. We are done with second-rate podcasts being out there. Don't do that. Now, it was very funny, but I actually, to be honest, I found that quite offensive because I think we have moved away from a time when the only people who were able to be in the spotlight were stars who were on TV or radio. We have really moved away from that. And really anyone who has a message and wants to communicate that has the right to be able to do that. I mean, why not, right? So why not just embrace that? But there are a few things to consider, but one of them in terms of the popularity I wanted you to consider is, which is something that I just Googled, is that podcasts are compared to blogs and YouTubes comparatively underdone. Now, you might not think that, but they're still a comparatively new channel. So basically, in the world, there's about 600 million blogs. So a lot of people start blogs and they don't necessarily do things. Now, I remember back in 2000, 2001, I was working in an open source unit doing research. It was one of my first jobs during working in Department of Defence. In those days, there weren't a lot of blogs around. In fact, one of the big blogs we were following was actually from people in Iraq, looking at where they were living and how they were affected by what was going on. And that was actually quite useful to look at where the strikes were and what was happening in terms of just, being monitoring from a humanitarian point of view. So a blog was really rare, and the blogs that were out there didn't tend to have a lot on them, and they tended to kind of break down quite quickly because they'd be so popular. Now there's 600 million, so it's much harder to start a good quality blog, get a community and get traction with it. It's not impossible. There has been some rhetoric in recent years saying the blogs are dead, but they're not, but they're certainly no longer as niche or as new as podcasts still are. In terms of YouTube, there's a lot as well. There's 23 million YouTube channels. I want to do more on YouTube this year, watch this space. And my youngest son, Audi, who you can hear typing in the background and talking, he has 2 YouTube channels. And he is teaching me a lot about YouTube. So definitely along a younger demographic, YouTube is very popular. But in terms of podcasts, there's only 800,000 of them. That means that for every podcast, there are 750 blogs and there's 29 YouTube channels. So having a podcast is a way that you can really stand out as a social media influencer in a different way. So I would actually, in terms of this question of should I start a podcast, I would bring it back to a basic question, which is before you rush out and buy the equipment, And please don't just go and rush out the equipment, because I've met so many people who have told me that they have bought all the equipment, but they haven't started their podcast. And they might not even have the right equipment because they're not that sure. So before you do that, there's a few questions to ask yourself. And the first is, well, who is your customer? Where is your tribe? And that will influence a lot about whether or not a podcast is going to be good for you and your business. Like if you are, say, selling, I don't know, just something randomly, some unique widget that's fairly high tech, your customer might be wholesalers. So you don't necessarily need to communicate with the end user. You're probably communicating with the wholesalers. So this probably isn't the best method for you, because the end user probably doesn't even care what brand it is, because it is already going into something else. In my case, my customer is very clear. For the Joyful Frugalista, my customer is women aged between about 30, late 50s. If you're not in that demographic, you are still welcome, but that's the majority of people who are on the Joyful Frugalista are women in that age group who are really interested in learning more about money. So what I do is about communication, education, financial literacy to women. Now that's important because women tend to listen to podcasts a lot. Now I haven't seen statistics on the breakup, but I know that most women I know like to listen to podcasts, including myself. So I already know that my customer base likes podcasts because a lot of them tell me about other podcasts that they listen to. Secondly, I would also suggest doing a podcast as part of a broader communications plan. Now I remember drafting one years ago when I worked in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I was then managing the Australia-China Council Secretariat, and we were thinking of doing Facebook. Well, we did do Facebook, but before we did that, I had to fill out a communications plan. Now, I'm not the sort of person who necessarily likes plans. I found it a bit annoying, but it was a great exercise, because as part of that, you've got to think about who is your customer, what are your key messages, where is your tribe? Because it's really tempting in this day and age to think that just because something's trendy, you should do it, because everyone's doing it, right? So I have 3 businesses now: the Joyful Frugalista, the Joyful Business Club, and the Joyful Fashionista, which is new. And the communication sort of methods for all 3 of them will be different. For Fashionista, for instance, which is still very, very new, it's a lot more visual. So mediums like Instagram work a lot better. For the Joyful Business Club, well, Instagram might work, but I think Facebook Lives, where you can share information, and YouTube are actually a lot better, as are blog posts. So that's just an example. Depending on where, what your business is and where your business is, different platforms would be different. If you were doing business, say, with China, you'd probably want to have a WeChat presence. But I'm pretty sure that most of my viewers here in Australia are not on WeChat. A few are, but most aren't. So therefore, for me to pivot to WeChat at this point is not the best approach, because we tend to think that we have to be everywhere. Well, we do and we don't. It's important to sort of go, where is my tribe and where am I best to communicate with them? So before you rush out and think you have to podcast because everyone else is, just think about it in the context of your overall communication strategy as well. Now let's look at some of the benefits of podcasting. So podcasting is really great for people who are multitaskers. So your key listener, if they're the sort of people who are likely to be too busy to read, and to be honest, I'm often in that category. I've made it a 2021 goal that I'm going to read more, and some days I really struggle with that, to be honest, because life gets too busy. Before I know it, it's 10:30 and it's already late, and I haven't done much reading. I still try to read every day, but it can be difficult. But podcasts are great because, unlike other mediums, you can listen to it while you're driving a car, while you're walking or jogging, while you're cooking dinner, while you're doing the dishes, while you're vacuuming the floor. And so it's one of those mediums that you can always have on. And in the past, we would have used radio for that, and radio is still very popular. But unlike radio, with podcasts, you can choose the topic you want. So you can choose to be informed about or entertained about something that you want to be by topic, which is really quite revolutionary. And even I know my lovely friend Jen Sederholm, who teaches on podcasts, she noticed she had a tradie in doing some work on her house, and he was like listening to the Andrew Johns Rugby League podcast. When in the past, a painter or a tradie might have been listening to the radio. Now they can choose to listen to a podcast of their choice. So it's great that you can get, you can get your message across for people who might be too busy to go out and buy a book and read it. They will still listen to a podcast, which is really quite unique. And another benefit too is I think people really trust when they hear things. Now, when I see things, I sort of trust, but I sort of skim over it and it's sort of interesting. But when I listen to someone speak, it really engenders quite a lot of trust. So we've seen, the John Laws effect, the Alan Jones effect. These kind of radio spokespeople, they have such influence in what they say because people trust them. They're listening to them. They're trusting them. There's something really unique about speech. It's about how we communicate really, I guess, as human beings predominantly, that really does engender this trust. And this is an important thing because a lot of my work, particularly when I go into, wanting people to buy my book, selling financial coaching, which I'm super passionate about, and my next course that I have starting next week, which I'm also super passionate about, trust is at the center of these things, because if you're going to be talking about money and finances and things particularly you want to fix with your money and finances, problems or issues that you have, investments that might have gone wrong, debts you might have, relationship problems over money, very vulnerable things, you really want to have that trust. So by talking on a podcast, what I'm constantly doing is building that trust with my community so that then they trust me with some of those bigger things. Which brings me to the next benefit, which is really podcasting can be a great content marketing tool. So I don't know who knows about content marketing. One of the earlier ones I think was a plow. So rather than just sort of go, here's a plow, here's a plow, here's a plow, they decided to do a magazine. This was in the US, and I should have researched this more, but I can follow up with details. Decided to do a magazine about things related to what a farming community might like to read about, right? So rather than just constantly buy a plow, buy a plow, buy a plow, I mean, you just switch off, right? You don't necessarily focus on that. They created this whole magazine about topics that a farming community would like. And then in that was, and this is a great plow. So therefore you are engaging people with your message and you're shaping that message in a more sophisticated way. You by talking about something related to that your community wants to engage in, they then engage with you. So an example could be that say you have a high technology product, for instance, rather than just talking about, I've got this really high-tech product and look how brilliant I am, you could have a podcast about innovation where you interview a lot of people about latest innovation. And, the fact that this is brought to you by an innovative company is in people's minds then associating with innovation. Does that make sense? For instance, you could have a skincare company where you had a whole channel about well-being and looking good and anti-aging and all those sorts of topics. And so you would attract that tribe of people who are interested in looking after themselves, looking good, wanting to appear younger. And then you could sell your skin creams, but it's not just about, hey, look at my skin creams. So that's how content marketing works. And podcasts are amazing for doing that. Another reason to do a podcast is, to be honest, what I also do, which is building a business in its own right. Yep, podcasting can be a big business in its own right. Jamie Lee Dumas in the US, he's a great example of someone who makes a fortune just from doing a podcast. Now, when I say just from doing a podcast, there's also a lot of spin-offs with other things. So there's also spin-offs with content marketing because you're promoting your own brand and you're promoting your own courses and you're promoting a number of other things. But key amongst that too is you are also deriving revenue often through having sponsorship. Now, there's all these different things on the internet about how you have to wait until you're this big to have sponsorship and this big to have sponsorship. I just say to that, be shit. If you have a good quality podcast, you have a good quality and engaged audience who like what you're doing, you are of benefit to a sponsor. Now, I'm very fortunate to have a great relationship with a Canberra-based IT company called 4Data, who sells website hosting services and other services. And they're a sponsor of the Joyful Frugalista podcast. Now, I think that's a great mix because a lot of people who listen to my podcast are bloggers themselves, so they're looking often at those hosting requirements. They will often have small businesses or side hustles that involve websites, or they'll have other sorts of things that will involve websites. So it's a really good match for my brand. It's not necessarily financial advice or a financial planner, although in the future, who knows, but it is a good match. So definitely a podcast is of itself its own business model. And the Joyful Frugalista business model is really about communications. So it lies at the center of that as well. I would also add too that one reason that I podcast is to grow my contact list. Now, I love meeting people. I love learning about what people do. I love meeting other people in the financial literacy space, so other writers, authors, speakers, and so forth. Now, of course, I could just go up to them and send them a random email, go, "Hi, I just love what you do." And maybe that might work. That might work for some. But when I send someone a message and say, "Hey, would you like to be a guest on my podcast?" That's quite a different story, right? That's quite a different story in terms of, bringing them on board, establishing a long-term relationship with them. Most people are quite happy. I've had a few knockbacks, but not many. Let me just say not many at all. Most people are really, really happy to have that opportunity to talk about what they do. And, the advantage is that they're sharing it on your networks, so they're expanding their networks. You are helping them tell their story, which is pretty awesome. The advantage you get is you're meeting someone pretty amazing. You're learning some amazing things from these amazing people. And hopefully they'll also share the podcast in their networks. So then that grows the networks for your podcast. So hopefully that will work that way. And I should add too that with podcasts, on average, people listen to them and engage with them a lot longer than they will a blog post or an Instagram post or a Twitter feed. Like I look at a lot of Instagram posts and they're lovely, but I'll look at them for a second or two and then I'll flick on. Twitter's about the same. I'll look at a bit. If I'm interested, I might comment, but I flick on. Blog posts, I might sort of skim read. But a podcast, with any luck, you've got someone listening to the entire podcast. So my podcasts are generally about 30 minutes in length. So I have someone who is engaging with that content for the full 30 minutes, which is pretty amazing. I mean, like I said, not everyone does, but it is a really unique way to engage with your community for longer and in a deeper way. So that is definitely, a huge benefit for podcasting as well. So you might think your head is full about why you should do it, some of the benefits. I want to also talk about a key reason not to do a podcast, and that is the time involved. Like, oh my goodness, the time. I knew it was going to take a lot of time, but even so, I was a bit surprised. My lovely husband Neil does the editing for my podcast, but even so, for every 30 minutes, it takes him between 4 and 6 hours. Usually about 4 and sometimes longer. And sometimes I will have finished a podcast interview and I'll think, I have just totally nailed that. It's going to be an amazing interview. We just had such amazing rapport. I asked such insightful questions. It was all just fabulous. And he'll turn to me and he'll go, "Sweetie, you've got such a bad habit of saying or ah or breathing before a question or going whatever it is." And he goes, "Do you know how long that's going to take me to edit all of those things out?" Now, of course, some people don't edit podcasts. They're quite proud of the fact that they like that style as being raw and rough. It's an individual thing, but I have that trust with my listeners, and I think it's respectful for my listeners and my guests to have a professionally edited podcast. I think that's also one of the reasons I get so many good quality guests, because usually they'll listen to previous episodes, they'll check them out, and they will see how they go. So how do you get started? Well, I've got some equipment in front of me and all sorts of stuff. I know this probably looks scary, but this actually isn't. This microphone only costs $30. This thing here is to make sure you don't sort of go put into the microphone too much. There's two types of microphones that you buy, And this one is called a dynamic microphone. And the reason is that this one works quite well when you speak close to it like this. Now this is important because it's not like a symphony orchestra where you want to hear the triangle at the back. You mainly just want to hear things nice and close. So you need this type of microphone. And you also need this. We also have headphones. They're not essential, but it is really good when you hear yourself quite clearly about how you're speaking. It's just a very useful thing to have as you're recording. It helps with improves the quality of what you're doing. This is the Tascam recording device we use. We have one with multiple channels, and there's a particular reason for that. For instance, say I'm recording with someone via the phone, and their phone connection, the volume's quite low and I'm quite loud. Well, that then means that my husband can take their whole track and boost the volume level up, and take my whole track and boost the level down. Or if I speak over a guest, he can then cut that out and move that along. So having the different channels can certainly help. Not everyone likes to do this, but that's kind of what we use. But before you go out and buy all these equipment, just try your phone. In fact, I've been a podcast guest on some amazing podcasts where just use your phone. If you've got a quiet room with not too many interruptions, like I've got interruptions today with the kid, typing very loudly on a computer. But if you've got a nice quiet place where this isn't happening, particularly something with lots of furnishings around that'll absorb the noise, this might be fine. And do a trial one. Do a trial one of you speaking for a bit, maybe 10 minutes. Have a go. Stop. Listen. See what you like. And you can upload that straight away with a lot of, there's a number of podcasting channels. I use one called Podbean. I'll share the information on the Podbean one in the comments below. But you can upload that straight away. See how you like the sound of your voice. And then if you like it, and then as you get better and better at doing it, then invest in the equipment. Like most podcasts do start out, they're not terribly, flash at first. They get a lot better with time. Wonderful. Thank you so much for listening. They are some of my thoughts. If you are interested in doing a podcast, leave some comments below, and I'm happy to share some more thoughts. Thank you.